Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, May the 5th. There's 96 hours to go until Labour starts a public discussion about Keir Starmer's future. But how far will it go? And what will then happen? Nobody knows, but the anger is building. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. The big thing from Downing Street today is a meeting convened by the Prime Minister to push for a whole society response to antisemitism. He's summoning figures ranging from police chiefs to the bosses of cultural institutions to Number 10 and pressing them to go further in rooting out anti-Jewish hatred. Playbook this morning saying it's not just the Golders Green stabbings that has triggered this, the spate of arsons coming on top of the Manchester synagogue terror attack.
But of course, there is politics as well. Yes, Keir Starmer is using the government platform of Number 10 to tackle this, but it's also dovetailing precisely with Labour's political attack message. Overnight, the party released an attack video against the Greens, featuring a Jewish woman reading out a sorry string of alleged anti-Semitic comments by Green candidates. So Keir Starmer is combining his national government message with his local electoral campaign, trying to squeeze the Greens 48 hours before polling opens. But will this make an electoral difference?
Well, the projection from Oxford University's Stephen Fisher suggests that Labour will win only 13% of the seats they contest. That's 1 in 8, meaning losses in London to the Greens and across the Red Wall to Reform. And effectively, that means Labour will face a challenge to both sides of its electoral coalition from left and right. No easy diagnosis for sorting that out, and not so many easy answers in the aftermath. As one side says, if you move left, then Red Wall Labour MPs will object, and the same goes in the opposite direction. So a pincer movement for Starmer expected from Thursday.
As it stands, Anne, at this moment, and predictions are notoriously impossible to lay your life down for, but as it stands, nobody in the cabinet looks willing to move first against Keir Starmer. And MPs, Labour MPs, are divided on how far to push the Prime Minister. Patrick Maguire's story in The Times, of course, is worth taking seriously, that some new intake Labour MPs are discussing an open letter demanding that Prime Minister sets out a timetable for his departure. That's reminiscent of what happened with Tony Blair in 2006, not that long after his third election victory, that resulted in a timetable appearing pretty quickly. This could mean, however, I think the divisions all around, that in the first instance, in the first few days after the local elections, there is an initial sense of stalemate and stasis. But I have been told of one of the things that could trigger immediate action against the Prime Minister, which I'll come on to in a little bit later in this podcast.
Oh, you tease. Another reason for the status quo perhaps pertaining in the short term is the darkening situation overseas, and the fragile ceasefire in Iran looks close to breaking, with the US and Iran exchanging fire in the Gulf. Now, the US military said their side had fought off attacks from Iranian drones, missiles, and armed small boats as it facilitated the passage of 2 US-flagged vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. That was symbolically very important to the US to get that done and show that it could indeed break through there. Meanwhile, an oil tanker owned by the UAE's state oil company was struck by drones fired from the Iranian side in a separate episode outside the strait, but dragging UAE also into the conflict, and high nerves about that. Brent crude is now up at $113 a barrel from just under 70 when this conflict started. So I think, as you flagged actually a couple of weeks ago, the idea that this was all under control in terms of cost of living implications, if we were calm and breathing deeply, is coming under more palpable strain, isn't it?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, those figures for Brent crude are downright miserable. I was looking them up on Bloomberg just before we recorded, and that just feeds through into everything. Remember, we're talking about a 6 to 10% in food inflation increase by the end of the year. I mean, it's just going to be really, really miserable for people's everyday life. Iran has been saying overnight that the US will be dragged back into war if it continues to escort ships through the Straits of Hormuz. Keir Starmer has made a point of weighing into those attacks that you just mentioned, and on the UAE vessel, condemning the drone and missile strikes and calling on Iran to engage meaningfully in negotiations. I think it's quite interesting in those remarks. He was actually kind of silent on the US. Takes two to tango. Labour MPs are actually open to the fact that the grim international backdrop makes action against Keir Starmer harder in the next few weeks as well.
Yes, I think as Vladimir Lenin said, the worse the better on occasion. There may be some small upside for one beleaguered prime minister of all of this. But here's something else that I think this is unleashing, Sam. It's interesting. As Starmer has now signalled pretty persistently, whenever he gets the chance, that he wants to move the UK closer to the EU, there are further signs the government is taking a robust approach with the US. And Jim Pickard in the FT has a very telling story that Rachel Reeves, no less, had a bust up with the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent during one of their IMF spring meetings a couple of weeks ago, with Bessent, who was a very outspoken character, rebuking Reeves for having called the Iran war a folly and saying that the goals of the conflict had never been clear. Bessent said they were clear and told her off for those comments. Now, Reeves apparently hit back and told Bessent she didn't work for him. She disliked how he had spoken to her, and there was no picture then of the two of them after that meeting, which is the minor family photo, which is now expected after such things. They've spoken since. The FT was reporting this was before the King's state visit, so there may be a band-aid had may been applied to that. But it solved a bit of a mystery for me, Sam, and I'll tell you why. In DC last week, just having talks around on the edge of the King hoopla, there were still very angsty noises about the underlying state of tetchiness with the US from the British government, and yet some people saying this could really get in the way of getting any trade improvement, but a lot of allergy also to those folly comments from Rachel Reeves. And I was wondering why it was being made such a big deal of, because I thought it was a bit of a one-off broadside. But I think it does signal that there is a bit of a divide in Labour here about some people thinking you can think that about the Iran action by the US, but do you necessarily have to say it? I think as you reflected, you've got Keir Starmer sitting it out there in the middle, but some people, the Chancellor included, feeling that if that is what is felt, then it ought to be said and signalled.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of this kind of global push me pull you that is in our control and in our gift, but there's a certain amount that isn't. The EU stuff is, but it feels like we're bouncing around on the US side. So let's see how that all shakes down. That's yet another part of the unstable backdrop going into Thursday's local election and the aftermath. I think the most useful thing that we can do this morning, though, Anne, is sort of do a roundup and assessment of exactly where we are ahead of Thursday and Friday. What's your starting point for the Labour discussion about whether Keir Starmer stays or goes, bluntly?
It feels to me like this is a party preparing for the worst, and then different groupings we can run through in just a moment, trying to figure out their positions on that score and how quickly or gradually they want to act on the Starmer question. So the story of the 2024 backbench is agitating for a timetable for Keir Starmer to say he's going, which is in essence then just announcing that you're on your way out and unleashing a full-on leadership battle. That is saying the quiet part out loud, that if you don't think that Starmer should be the candidate going forward into the next election, well, you might as well get on with it. But there are other straws in the wind, and one hefty one is Lucy Powell saying in a Guardian interview that when she's asked if Starmer is the right person to deliver changes in culture and priorities, the things she talked about in her deputy leadership campaign, Sam, and she just says, I'm not going to get into that. There's no one change that will affect all of these situations. We still have to tackle the big issues in the right ways with the right values. And then she said this, which really struck me. It was a side order conversation to focus on the personnel. Well, I mean, because that's neither backing Starmer fully to stay in place, but then she's also saying it's a side order, whether he's there or not, when it comes to Labour's big picture and chances of resets and success. And you can't really imagine a Prime Minister whose authority was intact being referred to in that way, or sort of circumvented in that way.
God, yeah. I mean, I thought for me there was just clattering alarm bells around the Lucy Pell Guardian interview. The point for me about what she was saying is more in the absence of what she didn't. I went back and rewatched 2 months ago. She found it quite easy on camera on a clip on Sky News to say, the Prime Minister has my full support. And what was glaringly absent from the Guardian interview was something akin to that repeated once more. That language was absolutely missing. So she's implicitly acknowledging the Guardian interview that there's a problem, and she's not denying that Keir Starmer is part of that problem, but just saying that the problem is bigger than just him, i.e. it could be personnel and direction, right? So that felt to me just like a shift, and a shift not one that Keir Starmer wants to hear. So as you say, it's kind of febrile and it's factional. Look, I'm not ruling out that something happens immediately after polling day, because politics at the moment and the decision to get rid of a leader is as much as anything else a spasm of emotion from the governing party's MPs. That's how it's happened in the past. That's what happened particularly with Boris Johnson and to a certain extent with Theresa May. And there's a world in which Wes Streeting decides he needs to get ahead of Angela Rayner, and there's a sort of arms race, and they trip each other up. Those are possibilities. But I just think just right now, in the next few weeks, for me, the political strategy of change just makes less sense that I can and see. And I just think that one of the issues that we've got is that nobody feels to me completely ready and like an answer to the problem that we've got. There may be a vacancy without particularly a large amount of strategic thought going into the creation of it, but I just think there's an issue. So take the obvious candidate for a lot of people now, and that's Andy Burnham. And Andy Burnham is important because he's the only figure that voters, according to polling, think would make Labour's situation better. He is the only person who gets a positive net score when people ask, would this person make a better leader than Keir Starmer? Everyone else gets negative figures, some really quite dramatically negative. And there are quite a lot of people now coalescing around, actually even on the right of the Labour Party, who think that Andy Burnham might just be the answer. But here's the thing. He is, of course, not an MP, and that's an issue. But I think there's a bigger thing that I'm picking up from supporters of Andy Burnham taking over eventually. And they just worry that Andy Burnham has a tendency to be a bit of a one-man band. He doesn't have a particularly extensive team. It's not completely clear what his policy platform is that is deliverable. He talks about getting rid of the whipping system, changing the national voting system. He talks about nationalisation. Right. But what are the things he could deliver if he came into Downing Street in this parliament? None of it feels retail and ready to them. And he is capable of launching into things without a plan. And we saw that before Gorton and Denton. He announced he wanted to stand and people expected the unions to fall into line and to MPs to back him. None of that groundwork had been done. So there is, even amongst those who now think that Andy Burnham might be the answer by the next election, there is a concern that he hasn't done enough of the hard yards to sort of act precipitously now, and therefore that's holding his candidacy back. And they just hope he gets himself in gear in the coming months.
And if Andy Burnham is the answer, what's the question? I think that also speaks to your point that Andy Burnham scores well, partly because he just has personal appeal. He has some character. He's made Manchester, his role there, into a power base. But as you say, Sam, what of that would he be offering in concrete terms as an alternative to even the Lucy Powell question? Priorities, direction, Labour values become something of an easy go-to phrase, but what would he actually mean by it? I mean, there you go, Andy. There's the challenge set by this podcast. If you were thinking of a quick return, and that you've got to get a quick return and a quick challenge, it does seem quite hard to sequence that one. What about Wes Streeting, the never going to give you up candidate. I spoke to a couple of Wes allies over the past few days. One point that one of them made is that there's been a narrative that their man has been floundering. He's fallen foul of the left by being seen to be too close to the old Blair magic, being a health secretary, and that I think increasing salience of the issue there of how to handle criticism of the deal with Palantir, that major tech company, has been dividing Labour, and Wes Streeting has sort of been on the more pro Palantir side of that, and that is, I think, becoming something of a negative for him. He needs to think about how to get some clarity on that. But one thing that they were saying is that you still, if you count up the numbers, he does still have some backbench support. There was a story briefed, I think, last week that he had about 81 MPs, and he could go if he wanted to be the person to put his head over the parapet. But Streeting for stalking horse, is that really what he's aiming for? So that just brings me back to thinking: is it Wes Streeting plus somebody else? Does it have to be a ticket? The one that's still spoken about, possibly improbable, but is the sort of Catherine Hepburn and Cary Grant one of teaming up with Angela Rayner in what would be the spikiest political rom-com?
I think that's still a really interesting question, because Wes Streeting has lots and lots of positives, but uniting the Labour Party, I mean, he has been a bit of a factional warrior for decades in Labour circles. So a unity figure is a hard ask of a Streeting premiership. Could that be with Angela Rayner? Well, there's lots of bad blood historically between those two, but it would solve a bit of a problem for both of them, except for the question of who is on top. I read almost daily stories about Angela Rayner's potential candidacy, but I just have a bit of an issue around whether or not it's actually going to make flesh. There are all sorts of things I'm picking up. You would think that Angela Rayner excites the sort of soft left caucus of MPs in the Labour Party. But here's the thing, Anne, she doesn't really have the Tribune group on side. That's quite a big 80-plus group of MPs. As far as I can see, they're tiptoeing much more to Andy Burnham than they are to Angela Rayner. That is tricky for her. What I would have thought of as her heartlands aren't with her. And there's all these talks of splits in her camp. Her partner, Sam Tarry, is pushing her very hard, but she's got a chief of staff, effectively Nick Parrott, who many people now are talking about the fact that they don't appear to be on the same page. I'm sure the Angela Rayner camp would deny that, but that idea has taken hold in Labour circles. And so I sniff too many issues around all of that. And that's before you get to having to make money in order to pay the HMRC repayment and possible fine, and the fact that she's really quite unpopular with voters, like much more unpopular than both Wes Streeting and even Shabana Mahmood. So I think there are lots of difficulties there. So look, those are many of the key candidates, and they've each got their challenges. But finally, I just think there's another reason why stasis in the first order might happen. And that's because there's not long to go. I'm a firm believer in the timetable theory of politics. And we've got the local elections this Thursday. You've then got the King's speech the following Wednesday, and there'll be a lot of oxygen sucked up by what the government's planning in that, crackdown on terror suspects and all the rest of it. And then the following week, when we get to Thursday, it's recess again for the May half term. So there's really only 2 weeks of Parliament sitting when there's the sort of backwash of all of that. And bluntly, a lot of that will be taken up by the King's speech before and afters. So the amount of time for over plotting is narrow, and however challenging people feel, there'll be a lot of distractions that prevent them from fully focusing on that.
Interesting whether that timetable theory can bear up against the wall of disapproval of Keir Starmer. Personally, I think that's it's the fact, as you say, that what the government is saying. I spoke to the cabinet minister last week. He said that things are going to move so fast after the election. We're going to make sure that there's not much space, and you've just laid it out there for people to get into looking like they're sabotaging the government's own legislative program. However, there's the calendar theory of political change. And then there's the kinetic one, isn't there? That things can just feel like it's just all gone. It's all too much. At some point, there's someone pulls that trigger. We should just pivot before we close out, Sam. I was struck by this anti-Semitism story and charges against the Greens we mentioned at the top of the podcast, and how that is really also handling into a story about how Zach Polanski as leader deals with the kind of issue that also haunted Corbyn's Labour. There's good detail today from Sam Blewett in the Politico playbook about the party suspending 4 candidates pending investigations of their social postings and comments, and with some links to some pretty gruesome content that's allegedly been posted recently and in the recent past by some candidates. But it's only half of the 8 alleged to be behind the comments which Labour has highlighted in its video. So insiders in the Greens voicing some concerns in this story that things are moving too slowly. They accept that they need better vetting, and Zach Polanski condemning some of the remarks. But it feels like a topic that still needs more clarity from the top about his own approach and how he intends to apply that rigour. Because the last time we saw Zach Polanski out and about was that very fiery interview with Trevor Phillips on Sky News, in which he was rejecting calls for a focus on anti-Semitism in Britain's Muslim communities, and really strongly disagreeing with 2 prominent British Muslims who had brought up that thought and said that was one of the areas where you really needed to act. Can Zach Polanski simply get by saying we need more vetting, we need it faster, or is there a fundamental issue about the way that he talks about this topic?
There is a familiar theme to all of that. Right, let's wrap it up. The 20-minute alarm has gone off. Massive week. We're here today, tomorrow as well, and then on Friday and Sunday to bring you everything that is going on in the aftermath of the local elections. Look forward to seeing you then.
Going to be seeing you all week.
I'm Michael Gove.
And I'm Madeline Grant, and we're here to tell you why you should be listening to Quite Right from The Spectator.
Every week we unpack the politics, culture and ideas driving the news.
And occasionally driving us to despair.
It's a place for a perspective that you won't get anywhere else. Much like this. He was the multiple wenching, chicken wing chomping lord of misrule.
And with the occasional detour. Your mode of dancing I would not recommend to any pregnant woman.
That's Quite Right from The Spectator, available wherever you get your podcasts.